How do you destroy a force that was built to survive wars, sanctions, uprisings, and assassinations? And what if the deadliest threat to the IRGC is not coming from Washington or Tel Aviv, but from inside the system it was created to protect? If you want more videos that go past the loud headlines and into the pressure points that really decide history, tap, like, subscribe, and share this with one person who still thinks every conflict is only about missiles and maps. Because once you see what is happening, here, the story stops looking like a normal military struggle. It starts looking like slow internal collapse. For years, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been described as the hardest core of the Iranian state. Not just a military branch, not just an intelligence network, not just a political enforcer. The IRGC has long been treated as the steel frame holding the entire system together. It protects the leadership. It projects power abroad. It crushes dissent at home. It influences the economy. It shapes foreign policy. And in moments of crisis, it is supposed to be the one institution that does not bend. That image matters. In systems like this, power is not only about weapons. It is about belief. It is about the idea that the center is solid, disciplined, feared, and permanent. The IRGC has spent decades building exactly that image. It wanted enemies to fear it, allies to depend on it, and ordinary people to assume it would always be there, no matter what pressure came from outside. But what happens when that image starts cracking from the inside? That is the real question. Not whether the IRGC can lose men in war. Every force can. Not whether it can survive foreign attacks. States prepare for that. The deeper question is whether an institution built on ideological discipline can survive when fear, mistrust, local rebellion, public anger, and quiet exhaustion begin eating away at it from multiple directions at the same time. That is a much more dangerous kind of damage. It does not always explode on camera. It does not always arrive with dramatic footage. Sometimes it shows up as a convoy ambush in a remote province. Sometimes it appears in a prison execution that sends a message to millions. Sometimes it appears in rumors inside the officer corps. Sometimes it shows up in the private decision of one trained insider who looks at the future and decides not to stay for it. And that is why this story matters so much. Because if the strongest arm of the Iranian state is being weakened by forces it cannot bomb away, cannot censor away, and cannot fully intimidate away, then we may be looking at a transformation much larger than a battlefield update. To understand that, we need to stop staring only at the obvious conflict. Yes, foreign pressure matters. Yes, regional confrontation matters. Yes, airstrikes and covert actions matter. But they do not explain the full picture. They only explain the visible layer. Under that layer is a more intimate struggle, and intimate struggles are often the ones that change states forever. Start in the southeast. Most global audiences barely follow Sistan and Baluchestan unless something shocking forces it into the news. That alone tells you something. Regions ignored by outsiders are often the regions where deeper truths hide in plain sight. Sistan and Baluchestan is poor, heavily securitized, and shaped by long-running grievances. It sits near the Pakistani border. It has a large Sunni Baluch population living under a Shia-led central state that many locals view as distant, suspicious, and punitive. The province has for years been associated with underdevelopment, smuggling routes, insurgent activity, harsh crackdowns, and a level of instability that Tehran never fully solved. This matters because the IRGC does not only operate there as a border force, it operates there as the face of state power. Every checkpoint, every raid, every retaliation, every security operation turns the Guard into something more than a military actor. It becomes the living symbol of who rules and how that rule feels on the ground. That is where one of the most dangerous pressures on the IRGC has been building. Sunni militant and separatist violence in the southeast is not a side story. It is not a distraction. It is one of the clearest examples of how the Guard can be bled by a conflict that refuses to disappear. Groups like Jaish al-Adl have understood something important for a long time. They do not need to defeat the Iranian state in a conventional sense. They do not need columns of armor. They do not need air power. They only need to prove again and again that Tehran cannot create lasting control in a province it treats like a security problem first and a society second. That is a brutal kind of warfare because it attacks confidence more than territory. A raid on an outpost matters, of course. An ambush on a patrol matters. A courthouse attack matters. But the deeper effect is psychological. It tells officers that danger is persistent. It tells local communities that the state is not fully in command. It tells the wider country that the regime's elite force can be challenged in places it has watched for years. And over time, repeated challenges change how power is perceived. Think about what counterinsurgency does to a force like the IRGC. It ties down manpower. It creates fatigue. It generates retaliation cycles. It makes intelligence failures more expensive. It exposes the limits of surveillance. It forces commanders to keep solving the same problem without solving its roots. And perhaps most dangerously of all, it turns every quiet road, every small compound, every border crossing, and every local grievance into a possible trigger point. For the outside world, such incidents come and go. For the institution living inside them, they accumulate. Every funeral accumulates. Every emergency deployment accumulates. Every warning that another official, another judge, another patrol, another commander could be targeted accumulates. These things do not always collapse a system in one dramatic blow. They hollow it out by repetition. That word matters here. Repetition. A single attack can shock. Repeated attacks can normalize insecurity. Once insecurity becomes normal, the state starts adapting in ways that reveal weakness, even when it tries to project strength. It militarizes civilian roles. It appoints hardliners to administrative positions. It expands surveillance. It talks tougher. It promises harsher punishment. Yet those moves often reveal the opposite of confidence. They reveal that ordinary governance is not enough. The center no longer trusts normal tools. It reaches for coercion because coercion is what it still understands. And when a state keeps reaching for coercion, it can deepen the problem it wants to solve. That is especially true in places where identity, poverty, and exclusion are already part of daily life. A province that feels neglected does not automatically become loyal because more armed men arrive. A community that feels suspected does not automatically become cooperative because punishments get harsher. Sometimes, the entire security approach becomes a recruitment ad for the next cycle of resistance. That is one of the reasons this story is bigger than any one militant operation. The IRGC is not just losing personnel in the southeast. It is trapped in a conflict model that drains credibility with every new round. And once you see that pattern, you start noticing that the pressure on the IRGC is not merely physical. It is moral, psychological, and political. Now move from the desert roads to the prisons and courtrooms. Here, the story becomes even darker. When a state feels exposed, it usually reacts in two directions at once. Outward, it talks about enemies. Inward, it hunts for betrayal. That second reaction can become obsessive because internal betrayal feels more terrifying than external attack. An enemy outside the border confirms the state's worldview. A leak, a protest, a filmed bombing site, a whisper of cooperation, a dissenting journalist, or an officer under suspicion suggests something worse, that the state may no longer fully control its own people. That fear changes how institutions behave. The IRGC has long been tied to internal repression, intelligence work, and the policing of dissent. But when pressure rises, the logic hardens. The line between spy and critic grows thinner. The line between dissident and traitor begins to disappear. Families searching for detained relatives become suspect. Ethnic and religious minorities become easier to frame as security risks. Media contact becomes dangerous. Possessing the wrong device becomes dangerous. Recording the wrong scene becomes dangerous. Asking the wrong question after an arrest becomes dangerous. This is where the system begins consuming itself. Executions and mass arrests are often presented by such states as proof of control. The message is simple. We found the infiltrators. We punished the traitors. We restored order. But that message only works if the public trusts the process, or at least fears it enough to remain silent without becoming permanently alienated. Once the machinery feels arbitrary, it produces a different effect. It does not restore confidence. It spreads dread. And dread is not loyalty. Dread can freeze people for a while. It can force obedience. It can quiet a street. But it also poisons the relationship between ruler and ruled. Everybody returned without a clear explanation. Every accelerated prosecution. Every confession believed to be coerced. Every execution carried out under a cloud of secrecy does not only remove one person. It sends a signal to entire networks of relatives, neighbors, classmates, co-workers, and local communities. The signal is this: anyone can be absorbed into the national security machine. That may look effective in the short term. In the long term, it creates a population that stops seeing the state as a protector and starts seeing it as a predator. For the IRGC, that is a devastating transformation because it is not merely a military organization. It relies on fear, yes, but it also relies on a narrative of guardianship. It claims to defend the revolution, defend the nation, defend sovereignty, defend order. Once a growing share of the public associates it instead with disappearance, execution, humiliation, and collective suspicion, the institution loses something it cannot easily replace. It loses moral insulation. Smash the like button if you want the kind of analysis that looks beneath events and asks what they do to the structure underneath. Subscribe if you want the next layer, and send this video to one friend who follows the region but still thinks the biggest story is always the one with the loudest explosion. That loss matters because coercive states survive not just by force but by selective legitimacy. They do not need everyone to love them. They need enough people to believe resistance is hopeless, enough insiders to believe service is honorable or at least safe, and enough bystanders to believe the system still has a future. Once those beliefs weaken together, the state may still look powerful while becoming increasingly brittle. Look closely at the logic trap here. The more the system fears infiltration, the more aggressively it purges. The more aggressively it purges, the more innocent or marginal people are likely to be swept in. The more arbitrary the crackdown feels, the more public bitterness grows. The more bitterness grows, the more the system sees a hostile society around it. That then justifies more repression. It is a cycle, but not a stable one. It burns trust faster than it builds security. And who helps run that cycle? The IRGC and the security structure around it. So while foreign observers focus on the spectacular side of confrontation, the Guard is also paying another price at home. It is becoming more deeply identified with a machine that punishes broadly because it fears specifically. That has consequences far beyond any one execution chamber. It affects recruitment. It affects morale. It affects how ordinary families talk about the state in private. It affects whether lower-level personnel believe they are defending a country or merely protecting a narrowing circle of power. It affects whether ambitious young people see the institution as a path upward or a trap. That last point is easy to miss, but it is crucial. Authoritarian security institutions need a steady supply of believers, opportunists, and careerists. They need people to join. They need people to stay. They need people to trust that loyalty will be rewarded and uncertainty will not swallow them. Once enough insiders begin to suspect that the institution cannot reliably protect even its own, the emotional math changes. And that brings us to the most sensitive part of this entire story. What happens when fear moves inside the officer corps itself? Not battlefield fear. That is ordinary. Not fear of foreign missiles. States at war expect that. I mean, fear of internal suspicion, fear of leaks, fear of invisible investigations, fear that the institution watching society most closely may also be watching its own ranks with rising paranoia. This is where elite organizations can begin to rot in silence. The public often imagines powerful security institutions as tightly sealed machines. In reality, they are human systems built on rivalry, ambition, distrust, and hierarchy. The more secretive the institution, the more rumor matters. The more ideological the institution, the more accusations of disloyalty matter, and the more pressure it faces from outside, the more tempted it becomes to look for contamination within. That search can become corrosive. If an officer starts believing that a colleague's fall was not simply personal misfortune, but part of an internal settling of scores, the institution changes instantly. Meetings feel different, promotions feel different, casual conversations feel different, travel feels different, a missed call feels different. Every shift in behavior becomes interpretable as a sign. People stop speaking freely. Some become performatively loyal, others grow quiet. Some attach themselves more tightly to patronage networks. Others start thinking about exit routes, and exit routes matter more than regimes like to admit. The mythology of the IRGC has long depended on the assumption that its core members are not just employees. They are guardians. They are the dependable ideological spine. They may argue, compete, even resent one another, but at the decisive moment they hold. That is the promise. But promises weaken when self-preservation enters the room. If officers begin to think that serving at a high level now means exposure not just to enemies, but to factional blame, internal inquiries, and the possibility of becoming expendable, then the institution faces a crisis far deeper than casualties. It faces caution inside its own command culture. And caution can be fatal for organizations that survive uncertainty. People outside such systems often look for dramatic defections. A famous commander fleeing a public confession, a leaked file. Those moments matter, but the more important process is usually quieter. It begins when insiders stop imagining their future inside the institution as secure. They may not rebel. They may not speak out. They may simply disengage inwardly. They may avoid risk. They may protect themselves rather than innovate. They may shift assets. They may prepare families. They may open channels abroad. They may wait for the right night to leave. That is how institutional erosion often begins. Not with a loud collapse, but with a private change in incentives. And once incentives change, ideology has to work harder to hold people in place. Think about the burden the IRGC is now carrying if all these forces operate at once. It must suppress dissent. It must guard borders. It must deter foreign enemies. It must monitor internal leaks. It must maintain the image of revolutionary confidence. It must manage a public that is tired, suspicious, and economically strained. It must reassure its own personnel that service still has meaning, safety, and status. It must do all of this while every mistake becomes evidence that the institution is no longer untouchable. That is not simple pressure. That is strategic exhaustion. And strategic exhaustion is different from battlefield loss. A battlefield loss can be reversed. A commander can be replaced. A unit can be rebuilt. Strategic exhaustion seeps into the soul of the organization. It makes every new challenge harder to absorb because the institution is already carrying unresolved strain from the last one. So when people ask, what is really hurting the IRGC, the answer may be broader than any government wants to admit. It is being hurt by a province it never truly stabilized. It is being hurt by the widening distance between force and legitimacy. It is being hurt by a system that answers insecurity with repression and then wonders why insecurity keeps growing. It is being hurt by the suspicion that danger may be inside the institution as much as outside it. And it is being hurt by the very human realization among some of its own people that loyalty is not a shield if the system itself becomes unpredictable. Before we go further, pause for 3 seconds and drop one word in the comments. Pressure. If you made it this far, well, that one word tells me you're seeing the deeper pattern. Then subscribe if you want scripts and breakdowns that connect the emotional story to the strategic one. Now let's pull back and ask the question that usually separates shallow analysis from serious analysis. Why is this happening now? The simple answer is pressure convergence. Institutions can often handle one crisis at a time. They can survive a protest wave if their elite units remain cohesive. They can survive insurgent attacks if the political center remains confident. They can survive foreign threats if their domestic legitimacy is still strong enough. They can even survive leadership losses if the chain of command is trusted and the broader mission still feels intact. But when several forms of pressure begin to overlap, something changes. Each crisis amplifies the others. Border insecurity makes the state look vulnerable. Domestic repression makes the state look afraid. Internal suspicion makes the elite look fragmented. Economic strain makes service less rewarding. Public anger makes policing more emotionally corrosive. International confrontation raises the cost of every miscalculation. Suddenly, the institution is not facing separate problems. It is facing a system-wide test of resilience. That test is especially severe for the IRGC because the organization was built to be more than a military force. Its authority has always rested on a fusion of ideology, coercion, myth, and utility. It is the sword, the shield, the guardian, and sometimes the gatekeeper of opportunity. It mediates power inside Iran in ways outsiders often underestimate. So when the IRGC weakens, this is not just about one security agency having a hard year. It touches the architecture of the state itself. That is why even small signals matter. A rumor of distrust inside the ranks matters. A local attack that embarrasses the center matters. A judicial crackdown that deepens social rage matters. A trickle of defections matters. A sense that service is no longer predictable matters. Individually, none of these may destroy the institution. Together, they can alter its future. And once an institution built on certainty starts losing certainty, it often doubles down on the only language it still trusts: control. That can mean harsher repression, more centralized command, broader surveillance, more ideological messaging, tougher punishment for dissent, greater suspicion of local communities, more ceremonial loyalty, more tests, more purges, more pressure on officers to prove commitment. But here's the paradox. Every extra turn of that screw may strengthen short-term obedience while weakening long-term durability. A force cannot indefinitely terrify a population, distrust its own middle ranks, manage unresolved peripheral conflict, and still expect healthy internal confidence. At some point, the cost shows up in behavior, and behavior is where the future becomes visible. Do officers volunteer for difficult assignments or avoid them? Do local communities share intelligence or stay silent? Do young recruits admire the institution or fear being trapped by it? Do families encourage service or quietly discourage it? Do insiders talk about sacrifice with conviction or repeat slogans by habit? That is where real decline begins to show itself, not only in casualty numbers, in the gap between the official story and lived belief. The wider region should care about this too. When core institutions of power start feeling insecure, they rarely become calmer. They become more reactive. They may lash outward to prove strength. They may lash inward to regain control. They may take bigger risks because appearing weak feels more dangerous than making a mistake. That means the weakening of the IRGC does not automatically lead to moderation. In the short run, it could produce the opposite. This is why simplistic narratives are so misleading. Some observers look at pressure on the IRGC and assume the story ends with easy collapse. History warns against that fantasy. Strong, coercive institutions can survive astonishing damage. They can adapt. They can become uglier and harder. They can turn scarcity into discipline. They can make fear look like stability for years. But the opposite illusion is also dangerous, the belief that because such institutions survive for a long time, they are immune to internal erosion. They are not. No security apparatus is immune to cumulative contradiction. And the contradiction at the center of the IRGC is becoming harder to hide. It was built to defend a revolutionary state against disorder, but many of the methods it uses now may be generating new disorder. It was built to project certainty, but many of its current behaviors suggest deep anxiety. It was built to bind ideology and power together, but more and more people inside and outside the system may be experiencing power without belief. That is dangerous in a way missiles alone are not. Missiles can destroy hardware. Erosion destroys confidence. Hardware can be replaced faster than confidence can. Now imagine the view from inside the institution. You are not an outsider reading headlines. You are an officer, or an analyst, or a mid-level operative. You know the official language. You know what is said in public. You also know what is whispered in hallways, what is avoided in meetings, and how often yesterday's certainty becomes today's danger. You watch unrest flare and repression answer it. You watch border trouble refuse to die. You watch loyalty become something that must be constantly displayed. You watch risk rise faster than reward. You watch mistakes travel upward as blame and downward as punishment. You wonder whether the institution still protects those who protect it. That inner question is one of the most powerful forces in politics, because when enough insiders begin asking it, entire regimes start behaving differently, even before the public understands why. There's also another layer people miss, because it is less dramatic than armed attacks or public executions. A force like the IRGC does not live on ideology alone. It lives on routine, salaries, status, family expectations, career ladders, access, protection. A sense that if you give your life to the institution, that the institution will give something solid back. When inflation bites, when public anger rises, when international pressure tightens, and when even loyal insiders begin to feel exposed, routine starts breaking down. That matters because routine is what makes hard systems durable. Once daily confidence weakens, the grand slogans have to carry more weight than they were designed to carry. And slogans are much less useful at 2 a.m. when a person is deciding whether to keep serving, keep obeying, or quietly prepare an exit. That private moment almost never appears in official analysis, but history often turns on exactly those private moments. If this breakdown is changing how you see the region, here's a different kind of CTA. Save this video now so you can come back to it when the next headline drops. Then share it with one person who cares about geopolitics but rarely gets the deeper institutional story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us, because the next major event will make more sense if you already understand the structure behind it. The most important point is this: the IRGC does not need to vanish for this damage to matter. People often think in extremes. Either the institution is strong or it is collapsing. Either it controls everything or it is finished. Reality is far more uncomfortable. An institution can remain powerful and still be degrading. It can still imprison, still deploy, still command, still intimidate, still influence regional actors, and still be losing cohesion over time. That kind of decline is harder to see because it does not always announce itself. It hides behind ceremonies, slogans, promotions, and televised statements. It hides behind selective victories. It hides behind fear. But underneath, the cracks widen. A force like the IRGC depends on 3 forms of confidence at once. First, internal confidence. Do its people believe the institution knows what it is doing and can protect its own? Second, social confidence. Do enough citizens, even reluctantly, believe the institution still represents order rather than predation? Third, strategic confidence. Do rivals, proxies, partners, and neighboring states still believe the IRGC can impose costs, absorb shocks, and remain coherent? What we are watching is pressure on all 3. Internal confidence is strained by suspicion, overextension, and the fear of becoming expendable. Social confidence is eroded by repression, executions, and the widening gap between state narratives and lived reality. Strategic confidence is challenged when insurgent violence persists, peripheral provinces remain unsettled, and the institution appears forced into constant reactive posture. Even if none of these pressures breaks the IRGC today, together they shape how it will behave tomorrow. It may become more brutal because brutality feels like proof of life. It may become more centralized because trust is thinning. It may become more ideological in language because ideology in practice no longer feels sufficient. It may rely more heavily on fear because persuasion has weakened. And in doing so, it may intensify the very conditions eating away at it. That is the trap. The institution responds to erosion by using methods that may deepen erosion. The result is not always immediate collapse. Sometimes it is a long decline masked by sudden shows of power. Those shows can fool outsiders. They can even fool insiders for a while. But over time, accumulated contradictions demand payment, and that payment often comes in forms that do not fit neat strategic models. A botched crackdown that ignites wider anger, a local commander who hesitates, an intelligence failure nobody admits until too late, a wave of quiet exits, a region that erupts again because none of the original grievances were touched, a younger generation that no longer sees the institution as sacred, only feared. When that happens, states usually say the same thing. They blame foreign plots. Sometimes those plots are real. External enemies absolutely exploit weakness. But exploitation is not creation. Outsiders can strike openings. They do not always create the openings. That is the hardest truth for rigid systems to face. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the foreign power you denounce. It is the internal pattern you refuse to change. And that brings us back to the title of this video. Something is killing the IRGC. And it is not only war from abroad. It is the grind of unresolved insurgency. It is the corrosive logic of repression. It is the spread of fear from society into the ranks of power. It is the slow evaporation of trust. It is the burden of being asked to hold up an entire state while the foundations beneath that state are becoming less stable. That kind of damage is easy to ignore because it moves slowly until suddenly it doesn't. History is full of institutions that looked intimidating right before they looked brittle, full of regimes that confused silence for support, full of elite forces that still had weapons, uniforms, and ceremonies long after they had lost the deeper confidence that made those things meaningful. The IRGC is not finished. That would be too simple, and simple stories are usually wrong. It remains powerful, dangerous, and deeply embedded in the system around it. But power and vulnerability can exist together. In fact, in moments like this, they often do. The real issue is not whether the IRGC can still strike back. It can. The real issue is whether it can solve the kind of damage that bullets and prisons and propaganda are bad at solving. Can it create legitimacy where force has widened resentment? Can it rebuild trust where suspicion has spread? Can it stabilize regions whose grievances were never merely military? Can it reassure its own people that loyalty will not become a liability? Can it carry the psychological weight of being the state's shield while also becoming the face of the state's harshest instincts? Those are much harder problems than stopping one attack or replacing one commander. And if those problems remain unresolved, then the future of the IRGC may be shaped less by the enemies everyone can name and more by the damage no parade can hide. So when the next headline arrives, and it almost certainly will, look beyond the blast, beyond the official statement, beyond the easy narrative of attack and response. Ask the deeper question, what is this event doing to the confidence of the institution underneath? Because that is where the real story is, not only in what the IRGC can still do, but in what it is slowly becoming. And if an institution created to be the unbreakable guardian of a revolution starts losing faith in its own durability, then the most important battle may not be the one the world is watching. It may be the one unfolding in quiet decisions, private fears, tired provinces, and rooms where nobody is fully sure who trusts whom anymore. That is how powerful systems begin to change, not always with one dramatic strike, sometimes with 1,000 smaller pressures that make the center feel less solid than it looks. If you stayed with me to the end, do one last thing that helps this channel more than you think. Comment with the word erosion if you believe slow internal damage can be more dangerous than visible war. Then like, subscribe, and share this with someone who wants the story behind the story. Because the loudest conflict is not always the one that decides the future.